The first time I really noticed her was when she came by to drop off a pie. Mrs. Walters, my 62-year-old neighbor, had always been friendly in that polite, neighborly way, small smiles and brief conversations whenever we crossed paths. But that day, there was something different about her. Something I hadn't noticed before. It was a warm afternoon, and I had just finished mowing the lawn. She stood at my door, a soft smile on her lips as she held the pie out to me. "Thought you might want a little something sweet after all that hard work," she said, her voice light but carrying a warmth that made me pause. I thanked her, took the pie, and she lingered just a moment too long. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I really saw her. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, her eyes bright and clear, but there was a softness about her, a kind of vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about her more than I should have. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just passing thoughts, moments where her face would come to mind unexpectedly. But the more I saw her around the neighborhood, the more I became aware of the subtle tension building between us. It was in the way her hand would brush against mine when she handed me something, the way her eyes lingered on mine a little too long during our brief conversations. Small things, things that could be easily dismissed, but they added up. And before I knew it, I found myself looking forward to those moments, those fleeting touches and glances. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, flipping through channels on the TV, when I heard a soft knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened the door, there she was, Mrs. Walters, standing on my doorstep with that same soft smile. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. I shook my head, stepping aside to let her in. "Not at all. Come on in." She walked in slowly, her eyes scanning the room as if she hadn't been here before. But I knew she had. A few months ago, when I first moved in, she and her husband had come over to welcome me to the neighborhood. Things had been different then. Simpler. But now, her presence felt different. There was an unspoken tension between us that hadn't been there before. "I was just checking in," she said, her eyes meeting mine briefly before she looked away. "You seemed a little distant lately." Her words caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I hadn't realized she'd been paying that much attention. "I've just been busy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't convinced. She sat down on the couch, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp as she looked at me. "Sometimes I think you keep too much to yourself," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, charged with something I couldn't quite place. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest for reasons I couldn't explain. "Maybe," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. She smiled again, but this time, it didn't reach her eyes. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together nervously before she glanced back up at me. "I know it's not really my place to say, but you can talk to me if you need to." Her offer was simple, but there was something about the way she said it that made my chest tighten. There was a sincerity in her voice, a warmth that I hadn't expected. And in that moment, I realized just how much I had been holding back, how much I had been keeping to myself. "Thank you," I said softly, my eyes meeting hers again. And in that instant, something shifted between us. Her eyes stayed on mine, and in that moment, the room seemed to grow smaller, the air thick with a tension that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. I wasn't sure what had changed between us, but there was no denying it. Something unspoken had passed between us, a subtle shift that made my pulse quicken, my thoughts race. Mrs. Walters, Diane, as I now allowed myself to think of her, seemed to sense it too. Her fingers still twisted nervously in her lap, but there was a calm in her gaze, an awareness that felt new. I watched as her chest rose and fell slowly, her breathing steady but shallow. The space between us suddenly felt too charged, too full of something that neither of us were ready to confront. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable," she said softly, breaking the silence. "That wasn't my intention." I shook my head quickly, almost too quickly. "No, you haven't. Not at all. She smiled again, that same soft smile that carried more meaning than words ever could. She trailed off, her voice barely more than a whisper. I worry about you sometimes. You seem so alone. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. She was right, of course. I had been keeping to myself lately, avoiding too much interaction with the neighbors, even with Diane herself. But it hadn't felt intentional, at least not until now. Now, I wasn't so sure. I guess I've just gotten used to being on my own, I admitted, my voice low. It's easier that way. Diane nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. I know what you mean. After my husband passed, it felt easier to close myself off. It felt safer. Her words surprised me. She had never spoken about her husband's passing before, not to me, anyway. I had always assumed she kept her grief private, the way she kept most things about her personal life. But here she was, opening up to me in a way that felt both intimate and vulnerable. I'm sorry, I said quietly, unsure of what else to say. She shook her head, her smile sad but sincere. Don't be. It was a long time ago. She paused, her gaze flickering to the window for a moment before returning to mine. But it still feels like it was just yesterday, sometimes. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. The conversation had taken a turn I hadn't expected, and the air between us felt heavier now, weighted down by the shared understanding of loss, of loneliness. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the room filled with the unspoken emotions either of us could put into words. And then, slowly, Diane shifted on the couch, her hand coming to rest on the armrest, just inches from mine. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it drew my attention like a magnet. I glanced down at her hand, then back up at her, and I could see the same tension reflected in her eyes, the same awareness of the space between us, the line we were dangerously close to crossing. I don't know why I came over tonight, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I needed to see you. Her confession lingered in the air between us, and my heart skipped a beat. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing as her words settled into my mind. There was something about the way she had said it, so quiet, so vulnerable, that made everything else fade into the background. I wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to respond without acknowledging the tension that had been building between us for weeks, maybe longer. I'm glad you did, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The truth of it startled me, but I couldn't deny it. Despite the confusion swirling inside me, the part of me that had been avoiding her, avoiding everyone, was glad she had come over tonight. Diane's eyes softened, and for a moment, the silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of what hadn't been said. I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, could see the slight rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, slow and steady. She was so close, closer than she had ever been, and the space between us felt like it was shrinking by the second. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She didn't move, didn't make any attempt to leave. Instead, her hand moved slightly, her fingers brushing against mine where they rested on the armrest. The touch was soft, barely there, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. Maybe, I replied, my voice just as uncertain. But you are. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes locking onto mine. There was a flicker of something there, desire, maybe, or fear. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was caught in it, trapped in the intensity of her gaze, in the undeniable pull between us. For a moment neither of us moved. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, could hear the rush of blood in my ears as the tension between us reached its breaking point. I don't know what's happening, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I can't stop thinking about you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I was frozen, unable to respond. The room seemed to tilt, the air thickening around us as her confession hung in the space between us. I had felt it too, the growing connection, the subtle glances and lingering touches, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way I hadn't been prepared for. Diane, I started, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of what I was feeling. She looked down at our hands, still brushing lightly against each other, and swallowed hard. "I know it's wrong," she said softly. "I know we shouldn't, but I can't help it." The vulnerability in her voice, the way she admitted it so openly, made my chest tighten. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, to push away the guilt that was starting to claw at me. But instead, I found myself reaching out, my hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both simple and monumental. Her breath hitched, and she looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite name. The silence between us was deafening now, the weight of the moment pressing down on us both. "I feel it too," I admitted, my voice rough with emotion. The truth of it hit me as soon as I said it. I had been trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself that it was just harmless attraction, but the pull between us was undeniable. It had been there from the start, growing stronger with every conversation, every touch, until it had become impossible to ignore. Diane let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around mine. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to hurt anyone." "I don't either," I said softly, but even as I said the words, I knew that we were already too far gone. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for something, answers, maybe, or reassurance. But I didn't have either. All I had was the overwhelming desire that had been building inside me for weeks, the pull toward her that I couldn't resist any longer. Without thinking, I leaned in, closing the small distance between us. I could feel her breath against my skin, could see the way her lips parted slightly as I got closer. And then, before I could stop myself, I kissed her. The moment our lips touched, it was like everything else fell away. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, it all vanished in an instant, leaving only the heat of her mouth against mine, the softness of her lips as she kissed me back. Her hand tightened around mine, and I could feel the tremble in her fingers, the way her body pressed closer to mine as the kiss deepened. It was slow at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters, unsure of how far to go. But as the seconds passed, the kiss grew more urgent, more desperate, until we were both lost in it, consumed by the intensity of the moment. Her hands slid up to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I couldn't help the low groan that escaped my throat. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her against me as the kiss deepened, the tension between us finally breaking free. It felt like we had been holding back for so long, and now that we had crossed the line, there was no stopping it. For a long time, we stayed like that, tangled together on the couch, our bodies pressed close as we kissed, our hands exploring each other in a way that felt both new and inevitable. The air around us seemed to crackle with electricity, and I could feel the weight of everything we had been denying crashing down on us all at once. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our hearts racing as we stared at each other in the dim light of the living room. Diane's chest rose and fell rapidly, her lips swollen from our kiss, her eyes wide with a mixture of desire and confusion. This is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't, I know," I said, though the words felt hollow. We both knew it was wrong, but that hadn't stopped us. It hadn't even slowed us down. She looked down, her fingers still resting on my chest. "I don't know what to do," she admitted softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't either." We sat there in silence for a long time, the reality of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy weight. The guilt was starting to creep in now, the awareness of what we had done, of the line we had crossed. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't deny the way I felt, the connection between us, the pull that had brought us together in the first place. "I should go," Diane said suddenly, her voice shaky. I nodded, though my chest tightened at the thought of her leaving. "Maybe that's for the best." She stood slowly, her movements hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she could trust herself to walk away. I watched as she gathered her things, her hands trembling as she adjusted her coat, and for a moment, I thought she might change her mind. But she didn't. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the handle. She looked back at me, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place, something between regret and longing. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be, I said, though the words felt like a lie. She nodded, but didn't move. The silence between us stretched on, and for a brief second, it felt like we were both waiting for the other to say something, to do something that would change the course of what had just happened. But neither of us did. Finally, she opened the door and stepped out into the night, the cool air rushing in behind her as she disappeared into the darkness. That I stood there for a long time after she left, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. The room felt colder now, emptier, and the silence was deafening. I had no idea what the future held, no idea if Diane and I would ever talk about what had happened, or if we would spend the rest of our lives pretending like it hadn't. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The house felt eerily silent after Diane left, her absence amplifying the space between us, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I sat there on the couch, staring at the spot where she had been sitting just moments before, the memory of her touch still lingering on my skin, her scent faintly hanging in the air. My mind was a blur, racing between the intensity of what had just happened and the crushing guilt that was slowly wrapping itself around me like a vice. I didn't know how long I sat there, motionless, lost in the whirlwind of my thoughts. The quiet hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the distant sound of cars passing by outside, the ticking of the clock on the wall, all of it seemed to fade into the background as I tried to make sense of what we had done. It had been wrong. So incredibly wrong. I knew that from the start. But now, sitting here alone, the weight of it pressed down on me harder than ever. Diane had been vulnerable, lost in her own grief and loneliness, and I had taken advantage of that. We had both crossed a line that couldn't be undone, a line that had been building for weeks, maybe longer, and now, we were left with the consequences. A part of me wanted to chase after her, to tell her that we could forget it ever happened, that we could go back to the way things were before. But I knew that wasn't possible. Not anymore. There was no going back from this. The connection between us, the forbidden pull that had drawn us together, was real, and it had shattered whatever semblance of normalcy we had tried to maintain. I stood up slowly, my legs heavy as I made my way to the kitchen. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would clear my head, but the thoughts kept swirling around me, relentless and unforgiving. I braced myself against the counter, gripping the edge tightly as I stared down at the sink, the water dripping from my chin into the basin. I felt raw, exposed, like everything inside me had been laid bare. I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way her lips had felt against mine, the warmth of her body pressed so close, the way she had looked at me with a mixture of desire and fear. It was all too much, and yet I couldn't escape it. The memory of her was seared into my mind, and no amount of guilt or regret could erase it. The next few days passed in a haze. I saw Diane around the neighborhood, of course. We couldn't avoid each other completely, but there was a distance between us now, a tension that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. Our interactions were brief, polite, but there was always something beneath the surface, something unspoken that hung in the air between us. She avoided looking me in the eye, and I did the same. It was as if we were both afraid that if we made eye contact, the truth of what had happened would come rushing back, and we'd be forced to confront it all over again. One evening, about a week after that night, I was sitting on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. The sun had just set, casting the neighborhood in a soft, dusky glow. I hadn't seen Diane all day, and part of me wondered if she was avoiding me entirely now. Maybe it was for the best, I told myself. Maybe the space would help us figure out how to move on from this, how to pretend like nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. The pull between us hadn't disappeared. It was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for another moment of weakness to bring it all crashing down again. As I sat there, lost in thought, I heard the soft creak of a gate opening. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat as I saw Diane walking down her driveway, her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her. She hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment, I considered staying silent, letting her pass by without acknowledging her presence. But something inside me wouldn't let that happen. "Diane!" I called softly, my voice hoarse from the strain of days spent in silence. She froze in place, her head snapping up as her eyes met mine. For a brief second, I saw the flicker of something in her gaze, guilt, fear, maybe even longing, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. She looked away, her shoulders tense as she stood there, not moving, not speaking. I stood up from the porch, unsure of what I was doing, but knowing that I couldn't let her walk away without saying something, anything. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the house, as if she was debating whether to walk away or face whatever this was between us. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly, her movements stiff and uncertain. I motioned for her to join me on the porch, and she walked over cautiously, keeping her distance as she sat down on the opposite side of the bench. The space between us felt vast, even though we were only a few feet apart, and the silence was heavy, suffocating. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The night air was cool, the soft sounds of crickets chirping in the background, but all I could focus on was the tension that had settled between us like a thick fog. Finally, Diane broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I looked over at her, her face half hidden in the shadows of the porch light. She was staring down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap. I could see the guilt etched into her features, the same guilt that had been gnawing at me for days. "I know," I said softly. "Neither did I." She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to make it go away." Her words hit me hard, because I knew she was right. There was no easy fix for this, no way to erase what had happened. We had crossed the line, and now we were both left to grapple with the consequences. "I've been trying to figure that out too," I said, my voice quiet. "But I don't think it's something we can just make disappear." She nodded, her eyes still fixed on her hands. "I don't want to lose you as a friend," she whispered. "But I don't know how we can go back to the way things were." The honesty in her voice made my chest tighten. I felt the same way, but I didn't know how to say it. We couldn't undo what had happened, and the connection between us, the pull that had brought us together in the first place, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "I don't know if we can," I admitted, my voice barely audible. The silence stretched on again, and I could feel the weight of her presence beside me, the heat of her body even though we weren't touching. It would have been easier if she had walked away, if we had both agreed to pretend like nothing had ever happened. But now, sitting here together, I realized that neither of us was ready to let go completely. "I don't regret what happened," she said suddenly, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. I turned to her, my heart pounding in my chest. Her eyes were still downcast, but there was something in the way she said it, something that made me realize she was telling the truth. She didn't regret it, and neither did I. "I don't either," I confessed. She looked up at me then, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of confusion and longing. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the unspoken emotions hanging heavy in the air between us. And in that moment I knew that whatever this was between us, it wasn't over. The future felt uncertain, filled with questions and consequences we hadn't yet faced. But as we sat there, side by side on the porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for where it would lead.